Okay, so in this review session, I want to pick up where we left off. So we were talking about the multiplier, and the idea of the multiplier, again, we're saying the way the economy works is that you have demand for goods. As a result of demand for goods, the firms supply goods. When they supply goods, they have to hire workers. That creates income, and the income is what sustains the demand. Okay? So you can have an economy where everything is in equilibrium. And if for some reason, demand, so let's say that the economy has an equilibrium where you have $100 worth of demand, $100 worth of production, $100 worth of income. So that's one equilibrium. If for some reason demand increases by $50, so the producers go out and produce another $50 worth of goods, and that creates income of $50. But it doesn't stop there, because now the person who received an extra $50 in their pocket, they're going to go out and spend, and that's going to create more, and it's going to create more, etc. And this is going to keep going. So the question is, how does this multiplier effect work? It's really a function of how much out of each dollar that people take home, how much do they spend, which is the definition of the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. The MPC is out of each dollar of disposable income that you take home, how much of it do you spend? Okay? So let's say in the example, let's say the MPC is 80 cents out of each dollar, so 0.8. So then if for some reason demand increases by $50, so let's start off actually, let me clear this up. Start off from scratch over here. Okay. So if demand increases by $1, that creates another dollar of production, another dollar of income. But the dollar of income is income in somebody's pocket, so they're going to go out and spend 80 cents, which is going to create 80 cents worth of production, an additional 80 cents worth of income. That income is in somebody else's pocket. How much are they going to spend of it? 80% of 80 cents is 64 cents, and so on. Okay, and you keep going until you have nothing left. Okay, so if you add up all the changes, okay, if you add up all the changes, it tells you that for a $1 increase in demand, the total increase in demand in the economy is $1 times the multiplier. What is the multiplier? Well, for an economy with a certain MPC, 1 over 1 minus the MPC is the total multiplier effect. So if the MPC is 0.8, the multiplier would be 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which is 1 over 0.2, which is 5. And that means that if you spend an additional dollar in the economy will grow. Total demand will grow by $1 times 5, which is $5. Okay, that's basically the idea of the multiplier. Okay, now, incidentally, with respect to the multiplier, the bigger the MPC is, that means each time you're going around the circle, you're spending a bigger portion of the money that's created, and the multiplier gets bigger, right? So when the MPC gets bigger, the multiplier gets bigger. Okay, and when the MPC is smaller, the multiplier is smaller. Okay? We also mentioned that other things that affect the multiplier is taxes, right? Taxes reduce the size of the multiplier because it means every time people have income in their pocket, they have to pay the government some of it. Okay, and that means there's less to go back into the economy. So taxes reduce the size of the multiplier. Also, imports reduce the size of the multiplier because, remember, we're talking about demand for American goods, production of American goods. And so if people go and spend their money on foreign goods, that's a leakage out of the system. There's less going back into the U.S. economy. Okay? All right, so we figured out that when spending increases, autonomous spending increases by $1, the multiplier for autonomous spending is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. What if you have a tax cut? Okay, in other words, okay, demand equal to C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports, right? So if government spending changes, if investment changes, if consumption spending changes, or if net exports change, for every dollar change in any of these things, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. But if taxes change, okay, then what happens is with the spending multiplier, we know if the government spends more money, okay, that's immediately going into the economy. Okay, so for every dollar the government spends, the economy grows by a dollar times 1 over 1 minus MPC. Same thing for investment, consumption, net exports. But if the government gives you a tax cut, okay, the first thing you're going to do, so if the government says, I'm going to give you $1 as a tax cut, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to actually save some of it. So if the MPC is 80 cents out of each dollar, you're actually going to save some of it, and then you're only going to actually spend 80 cents. Okay? So the first shot to the economy is not $1. The first shot to the economy is actually 80 cents because you're going to first save before you decide what to spend. And so that's why we say there's a tax multiplier, okay, which is equal to the usual multiplier, but that's only applied to the fraction of the dollar you decided to spend, okay? That's why the tax multiplier is MPC over 1 minus MPC, or MPC over MPS, okay? And so that's why we said for every dollar in spending has more impact than any dollar of tax cut, okay? And that also got us into a discussion of the balanced budget multiplier. So in other words, let's say that the government increases spending by $100 and they increase taxes, right? So when they increase spending, that grows the economy. When they increase taxes, that shrinks the economy. So let's say that they increase taxes by 100 and they spend $100 more. So as far as the government's budget is concerned, they're running a balanced budget, right? So what happens? Well, for the $100 the government spends, okay, the effect on the economy is 100 times 1 over 1 minus MPC. For the $100 tax cut, the effect on the economy is to shrink the economy by MPC over 1 minus MPC. So what's the net effect? Okay, so we have 100 over 1 minus MPC minus 100 times MPC over 1 minus MPC, okay, which is 100 times 1 minus MPC over 1 minus MPC, which is $100, okay? So the balanced budget multiplier says that if you raise government spending by a certain amount and raise taxes by the same amount, the economy will grow still. Not like they completely cancel out. Because government spending is so much more powerful, the economy will actually grow by the same amount you originally spent. Okay? So the balanced budget multiplier is actually equal to 1. Okay? Because it says if government spending increases by 100, taxes increase by 100, the economy will grow by 100 times 1, which is 100. Okay? All right. Let's now move on out of this multiplier discussion. And let's talk about aggregate demand. So we said that demand comes from consumers, businesses, the government, and exports minus imports, although we haven't focused on that much, okay? So any increase in consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports is going to cause an increase in demand. Any decrease will cause a decrease in demand. And by the way, taxes affect consumption and investment spending because when you have more taxes, you have less income, so that reduces consumption and investment. Okay? We spoke about if you were to draw aggregate demand, here's GDP, here's the price level. So we figured out that aggregate demand, which is the sum of demand over everybody in the economy, is a negative function of prices. Reason being that when prices go up, the value of your wealth goes down, and so your total demand goes down. Right? In other words, when prices go up, the value of wealth decreases, and that causes people to spend less. So there's a negative relationship between price level and consumption. And since consumption is a component of aggregate demand, we're saying aggregate demand is a negative function of the price level. Okay? And again, if consumption increases, investment increases, government spending increases, or net exports increase, it's a rightward shift in the okay? And alternatively, if they decrease, if any of them decrease, that's going to cause a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay? What about the supply curve? Okay? So, with the supply curve, we said there is a long-run supply curve and there is a short-run supply curve. The long-run supply curve really aggregate supply. It's a function of the resources available to produce. It's your potential GDP. Okay? What would cause, and so if it's your resources, your potential GDP, that is completely unrelated to the current price level. It is what it is. Okay? What would cause the aggregate supply curve to increase? Well, if resources increase, if technology increases, which allows you to produce more with the current resources, anything that causes potential GDP to increase, potential, your maximum that you can produce, is going to cause the supply curve to shift to the right, and bad things, right, is going to cause the long-run supply curve to shift to the left. Okay? Let's now talk about putting it together. So, okay, we said the neoclassical approach, or the classical approach to economics, said they only knew that the long-run supply curve existed. They didn't realize there was a separate short-run supply curve, and you have the aggregate demand curve. Where they meet, we call that potential output. That's your max that you can produce, okay? So the classical approach assumes you're always on your potential, or in other words, if you recall when we were talking about the production possibilities frontier, okay, where let's say you have labor and capital, right? So the classical approach always assumes you're on your PPF, okay? And so what happens is that if you have a change, so for example, suppose I tell you that investment spending decreases. So as a result, aggregate demand decreases, right? Because aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. So if investment spending decreases, aggregate demand is going to decrease, shifts to the left. Well, guess what? Where's the new equilibrium? Still at potential GDP, just at a lower level. Okay, so the classical approach does not understand the possibility of having a recession because you're always on your potential. There's no unemployment. Unemployment would put you inside. There's no unemployment. You're always on potential. Okay? Alternatively, if for some reason, starting from where you are, consumption goes up, so then aggregate demand shifts to the right, you're still going to be on potential, but prices are going to go up. Okay, so that's the classical approach for how the economy works. Okay, the problem is that when the Great Depression happened, people realized this cannot be a complete analysis because they saw that obviously the economy was not producing at potential, right? So there was a problem here. Okay, so in comes Keynes, and Keynes says that in addition to the long run aggregate supply curve, so we have our aggregate demand curve, right? And we have our long run aggregate supply curve. Keynes points out that there is a short run aggregate supply curve, okay, which is a function of costs of production, okay, which we're familiar with from the micro framework, okay? So anything that causes the cost of production to go up is going to shift you to the left. Anything that causes the cost of production to go down is going to shift you to the right, okay? All right, so now if you have this kind of situation, let's see what happens. Let's see the different possibilities, okay? One possibility is that aggregate demand shifts to the left. For example, maybe consumption goes down or investment goes down, okay? As a result, you would go to this point, okay, where now you're not at the potential. In fact, you're at less than potential. Okay, we call this a recessionary gap. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is that perhaps demand heats up, okay, and you find yourself beyond potential. How could you be producing beyond potential? Because potential GDP tells me what's your maximum amount that you could produce if all your workers are working 9 to 5. But you could employ these workers over time, and so you could produce more than potential for a short period of time. If you do, okay, the difference between where you're producing and what your potential is called an inflationary gap. Okay? So basically what Keynes pointed out is that in the short run, you could have a situation where you're producing less than potential or more than potential. Okay? The only thing is that eventually, in the long run, you have to go back to potential. So how do you go back to potential? If the government does not interfere and you leave the economy to do things on its own, if the economy finds itself in a recessionary gap, basically you have tons of workers who are unemployed. What's going to happen is wages are going to fall. When wages fall, the cost of production falls, and that's a good thing for employers. So the supply curve, the short-run supply curve, will shift to the right, and you end up back at potential at a lower price level. Okay, this is how the economy would fix itself, okay, if you have a recession. If you have an inflationary gap, an overheated economy, all these workers who are overworked are going to start asking for a raise. Eventually, you have no choice but to raise their wages. That increases your cost of production, and the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left, where you're back at potential but at higher prices. That's why it's called an inflationary gap, because it leads to inflation. Okay? This is how the economy would fix itself. All right? Incidentally, there are also other possibilities, right? Because these possibilities I just showed you were what happens if demand shifts, right? So if the initial thing that happens is demand shifts to the left, you end up in a recessionary gap. In the long run, supply shifts to the right so that you're back at potential. The second possibility was demand shifts to the right. In the short run, in the long run, supply shifts to the left, you're back at potential. But you could also have other possibilities. Here's the aggregate demand curve. Here's the long run aggregate supply curve. Here's the short run aggregate supply curve. So you could have a situation where what kicks you out of the long run equilibrium is a movement in the supply curve. Okay, so for example, let's say that there is some kind of a disaster. Let's say there's a hurricane or there's some kind of a huge storm that destroys factories. As a result, let's say the cost of oil goes up or whatever. So in other words, costs of production go up. That's a negative shock to the economy. Okay, and that is a situation where you have a recessionary gap. Okay, this situation where you have a recession and at the same time prices have gone up, we call that stagflation. Okay, because you have a stagnating economy with inflation. It's like a double whammy. Okay, this is particularly problematic because normally every recession has a silver lining, right? In a recession, normally, if it's a demand-caused recession, output is shrinking but prices are falling. Or when the economy is overheating, output is growing but there's inflation. So there's always a flip side. With stagflation, there is no flip side. It's all bad news, right? The economy is shrinking and there is inflation. All right, how do you get out of a stagflation on your own, the economy on its own, without government intervention? Hopefully wages go down and that brings you back. Or perhaps the negative shock goes away and you go back. Okay? And another possibility would be if supply moves to the right for some reason. Okay, for some reason, maybe technology. But usually when that happens, if it's a technological improvement, you also have a movement in the long run supply curve, right? Because that increases your potential as well. Okay? All right, now let's go back to the analysis of so we mentioned if the government doesn't get involved, right, what can happen in the short run and in the long run. So now let's talk about what the government can do to make a recession last a shorter amount of time. Okay, so starting off from this point, from the long run equilibrium, let's say that you have a standard demand side recession. If the government doesn't do anything, we said eventually wages go down and the supply curve will shift to the right. But that might take a very long time. Okay? Alternatively, what the government can do is take steps to try to boost demand. What can they do to do that? Well, they can go out and increase government spending, or they can cut taxes, which is not as powerful, but it works in the same direction. And that's fiscal policy, which is decided by Congress and the president. Alternatively, the Federal Reserve, the Fed, or really more correctly, the FOMC, we're going to talk about that later, can reduce interest rates. Because when you reduce interest rates, it's like giving a booster shot to the economy. Okay? If you increase government spending, aggregate demand goes up. If you decrease taxes, consumption goes up. If you decrease interest rates, then consumption goes up and investment goes up. Okay? So this is called monetary policy. Okay? And we mentioned we have expansionary and we have contractionary policies, right? Expansionary policies are policies that cause the demand curve to shift to the right. Contractionary policies are policies that cause the demand curve to shift to the left. Okay? Alternatively, if the economy is overheated, okay? And you don't want to end up in a bigger inflation, because if the government doesn't do anything, wages go up, you end up in a much bigger inflation. So if you want to prevent that, you want to take steps to cool the economy off. And the way you would do that is you would reduce government spending, increase taxes, or increase the interest rate. This is called monetary policy, and this is called fiscal policy. Okay? And so these in the blue would be considered contractionary policies, and the red would be considered expansionary policies. Okay? The final item is automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers, so the problem, so we mentioned the pros and cons of fiscal versus monetary policy, and we said part of the problem with fiscal policy is that since in order to pass fiscal policy you have to have the Congress and President agreeing, that could take a while. So typically it takes like more than 6 months. In the meantime, the recession is happening, right? But once they agree, government spending goes up, there's an impact automatically on the economy, or taxes go down, there's an impact automatically. Monetary policy, the Fed decides it, right? The FOMC decides it, and so it doesn't take much time to implement monetary policy. The problem with monetary policy, however, is it's only an incentive, right? By reducing interest rates, you're incentivizing consumption and investment to go up, but they don't necessarily, right? So even though monetary policy can be implemented fairly quickly, its effects can take a long time. Okay, so in other words, both fiscal and monetary policy take a while to actually affect the economy. To get around this problem, we have what are called automatic stabilizers. So automatic stabilizers are rules that we have on the books, programs we have on the books, which automatically increase spending when there's a recession and decrease spending when there's an overheated economy. Okay? What are types of automatic stabilizers? For example, unemployment compensation. Okay, so unemployment compensation says if you lose your job, you can apply for unemployment benefits and you will get them. Okay? If you didn't have unemployment benefits, then when there's a recession, you lose your job, you don't have any money. Okay, so you reduce your spending tremendously because you don't have any money. And because of the multiplier effect, the economy shrinks even further, even further, even further. So with unemployment benefits, your spending doesn't go down as much because at least your benefits, unemployment benefits, allow you to spend some money to live. So it prevents the economy from shrinking as much as it would have. Okay, in other words, it's like without the unemployment benefits, the economy would shrink a lot more. So the unemployment compensation boosts the economy back. Not all the way, but it boosts it back so it's not as bad. Okay? Another automatic stabilizer is the income tax system. The income tax basically says, depending on how much money you make, you pay a certain fraction of your income. So if you go into a recession, people's income goes down, automatically they pay less income because taxes are a percentage of income. So that means that because of the income tax, your income doesn't go down as much because your tax bill goes down in a recession. Okay, so that's an automatic stabilizer. It also works when the economy is overheating. When the economy is overheating, unemployment compensation goes down because people they haven't lost their jobs, right? Everybody's working, so these go down. And people end up paying more in taxes because when they're earning more money, they're paying more in taxes, so that helps to cool the economy off. Okay, so the point is that automatic stabilizers, like without them, the business cycle might be like this. With the automatic stabilizers, it dampens the cycle, right? So it's a stabilizer. It stabilizes the economy. Okay. All right. That is all I wanted to go over. That's it. Thank you.